It's the 1960s, and the space race between America and Russia is on, and the Russians are leading. They have Sputnik, the first man-made object to orbit the Earth. The first probe sent to the moon was also done by the Russians. And they have the biggie. They have Yuri Gagarin, the first man into space. And they were about to get their fourth major achievement, the first person to walk in space. Now, there wouldn't be any issues getting to space, but from that point on, they would have to overcome three major obstacles in order to consider this a success. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. Давайте начнем. Всем привет, меня зовут Jared, я делаю русский язык легким. Hey everybody, my name's Jared and I make the Russian language easy. Today's Friday, and for those of you that follow my channel, you know every Friday we take a break from the grammar and vocabulary and just do a little something cultural there. It's March 18th, 1965, and a 30-year-old Alexei Leonov and Pavel Belyayev are launched into space to complete the first spacewalk. The mission is known as Voskhod 2, but because of the intense rivalry with the Americans, the actual goal of Voskhod 2 is kept a secret. They get into space and they shortly set to task of performing the first spacewalk. All of this is being televised live in Russia. As Alexei Leonov opens the hatch and exits out in and becomes the first person to make this spacewalk, he makes history. And because it was such a secret, his family down on Earth didn't know what he was doing. I want to read an excerpt from an article from the Smithsonian Magazine, and I'm going to read a few of those excerpts here today about what his daughter and his father said when they first saw him leave the capsule and make humans' first spacewalk. The first comment comes from his daughter. "What is he doing? What is he doing?" she wailed. "Please tell Daddy to get back inside." And then Alexei Leonov, who is telling this story in the article, he goes on to state, "My elderly father, too, was upset. Not understanding that the purpose of my mission was to show that man could survive in open space, he expressed his distress to journalists who had gathered at my parents' home. 'Why is he acting like a juvenile delinquent?' he shouted in frustration. 'Everyone else can complete their mission properly inside the spacecraft. What is he doing clamoring about outside? Somebody must tell him to get back inside immediately. He must be punished for this.' His anger soon gave way to pride when he heard a live broadcast of President Leonid Brezhnev's message of congratulations beamed up to me from the Kremlin via mission control. 'We members of the Politburo are here, sitting and watching what you are doing. We are proud of you,' Brezhnev said. 'We wish you success. Take care. We await your safe arrival on Earth.' And about 12 minutes into the spacewalk, Pavel radios over to Alexei telling him it's time to come back inside the capsule. It's at this point when they run into the first major obstacle. As Alexei turns to get back into the airlock, he realizes he no longer fits. Because of the vacuum of space, and because technology wasn't quite what it is today and they hadn't perfected everything, his spacesuit inflated so much that he couldn't fit back into the airlock. Now, the inflation of the spacesuit posed three different problems for him. One was just the size. He physically couldn't get back into the airlock. The suit was bigger than the diameter of the airlock. But there were two other issues. One, if you've ever blown something up and blown it tight, you know it's very rigid and it doesn't bend. So his arms and legs couldn't move very easily to try and solve the problem. On top of that, the suit had inflated so much as well, his hands and his feet had actually come out of his boots and his gloves. So he didn't really have the resources needed to do microscopic work. Think of making a tiny repair with large mittens on, right? Doesn't really work. That was kind of the situation he was in. Obviously, he needs to get back in or things aren't going to end well for him. Hey, you guys, real quick, if you're liking this, I would love it if you would smash the like button down below. It helps distribute it to other people, and it's kind of a way of saying thanks to me for making the video. All right, let's keep going. What he realizes is that he can open a valve on his suit, which will release some of the oxygen in his suit and deflate it, hopefully to the point where he can fit back into the airlock. Now, there's two risks with this. The first is pretty obvious. Will he have enough oxygen? If he lets too much out, he won't, obviously. But the second issue is what divers call the bends. And that is decompression sickness. Things aren't going according to plan. The TVs down on the ground are shut off, and he begins an intense struggle to try and make all of this work. With the suit not being able to move, It being so big, and with him not having complete use of his hands, it's a very strenuous task. It takes him several minutes to try and make this work. In fact, it's so strenuous, his body temperature increased to the point where he almost suffered heat stroke. He talks about remembering two specific things at this point in the journey. One, all of the sweat that was in his spacesuit. Normally when we sweat, it evaporates, right? Well, he's in a spacesuit. It's a locked environment. So that sweat just stays in the spacesuit. And he remembers just feeling it sloshing around in his feet. There was so much sweat. The other thing he talks about remembering is hearing his breathing, hearing his voice up there. Those were kind of the two sensations he has the most memory of. Let me go back to the Smithsonian article and read to you in his own words what happened next. I could feel my temperature rising dangerously high, with a rush of heat from my feet traveling up my legs and arms. Due to the immense physical exertion all the maneuvering involved, it was taking far longer than it was supposed to. Even when I, at last, managed to pull myself entirely into the airlock, I had to perform another almost impossible maneuver. I had to curl my body around in order to close the airlock so Pasha could activate the mechanism to equalize pressure between it and the spacecraft. What he means is that the original intent was for him to enter the airlock feet first, but he couldn't do that because of all the other issues that had gone on wrong. In some other articles, they talk about how he ended up having to release the oxygen and move in head first. But then the way the airlock is set up, he had to curl up, turn around, get his feet pointing the right direction. And then Pavel, who is also called Pasha, it's a nickname there in Russian, was able to reset the airlock, open it up, and let him in. Let me read you one more sentence. Once Pasha was sure the hatch was closed and the pressure had equalized, he triggered the inner hatch open and I scrambled back into the spacecraft, drenched with sweat, my heart racing. Imagine being on a 16-foot tether to this little spacecraft and not knowing if you're going to get back in. It's pretty intense. I can only imagine what he was feeling then. I bet you he was very excited to get in. That was the first major obstacle, getting back into the spacecraft. But there were still two more obstacles they were going to have to overcome if they were going to call this mission, Voskhod 2, a success. The second obstacle involves actually getting back to Earth. 5 minutes before the retro rockets were supposed to fire and take them out of orbit and start pushing them back to Earth, they realized that the automatic guidance system for re-entry was malfunctioning. They were going to have to do this manually. That means they were going to have to decide where were they going to land, and they would have to decide when to fire the retro rockets and how long they were going to have to fire those. And they knew they had to decide all of this on the next orbit. They needed to exit orbit on the next pass around the Earth. They successfully fired the retro rockets, get out of orbit, and begin their descent back to Earth. It's at this point where they have their first radio communication that they've had with Kremlin in a very long time. And it's from Yuri Gagarin, the first person ever in space. And let me read that to you. As our orbit brought us above Crimea, we received the first ground control communication we'd had in some time. How are you, Blondie? Where did you land? It was Yuri Gagarin. He always called me Blondie. It was good to hear his voice. Even in such difficult circumstances, he sounded full of warmth, even relaxed. But from what he was saying, it was clear Mission Control thought we had already landed. Pasha clicked on his microphone. We had to turn off the automatic landing system. We have only enough fuel to do one correction, and beside that, the indicator shows that the main engine for re-entry is very low on fuel. Pasha reported in as steady a voice as he could. We can make only one attempt at re-entry. We are asking you, therefore, to go into emergency mode. So as they're beginning their descent, they have to do everything manually. And it's a two-seated aircraft, and obviously they're sitting next to each other. But Pavel actually has to get out of his seat and lean over Alexei to line up to where this visual cue, this small little window is in the aircraft to make these adjustments to make a line of sight and make an accurate re-entry there. And Alexei, again in another article, he talks about actually holding Pavel up so that he can get over, help him lean over, make the line of sight adjustment, and then just at the right time, he has to flop back down into his seat because it's such a small aircraft, and they have to distribute the weight correctly so that the center of gravity is evenly balanced. They do this successfully, and their descent to Earth continues. Alexei then goes on and explains that he expected to feel the effects of gravity pulling them down. But what he noticed is he felt like he was actually getting pulled backwards in a way that he hadn't anticipated. And he knew that something was wrong. He looks out his spacecraft window and he notices a communication cable has wrapped around the spacecraft. The landing module was supposed to have separated from the orbiting module. And because of that, the center of gravity was off and it was spinning wildly. Well, fortunately for them, as they were re-entering Earth and, Earth's atmosphere, it burns things up and get really hot, it burned that communication off, which allowed the orbiting capsule to detach. And Alexei and Pavel were able to right the aircraft, get it stabilized, and re-enter into Earth's atmosphere. As they get closer to the ground, the chutes deploy, and Alexei goes on to describe how this was one of the more peaceful moments of the flight, excluding the spacewalk, of course, how it was quiet and it was gentle, and they're just falling to the ground under the protection of these large parachutes. Obstacle number 2, returning to Earth, overcome. You think they'd be done at this point, but there's still one more obstacle. They actually have to get back. Remember that they're not landing in the place that they had originally anticipated landing. They're landing as close as they can to a little city called Perm. Now, when they land, they overshoot it, and they are in the middle of deep, dark Siberia. And keep in mind, this is the middle of March. It's still winter. It's freezing cold. They're way off target, and they're in a very remote part of Russia. Let me read again in Alexei's own words what their first experience was now that they're back on Earth. We had to get out of the spacecraft to assess our location, but that was not easy. When we flicked the switch to open the landing hatch, the explosive bolts holding it shut were activated and a smell of gunpowder filled the cabin. But though the hatch jerked, it failed to open. Looking out the window, we could see the hatch was jammed against a big birch tree. We had no alternative but to start rocking the hatch violently back and forth, trying to shift it clear of the tree. Then, using all his strength, Pasha managed to push the hatch away from the remains of the bolt, and it slid back and disappeared into the snow. We took a deep breath of fresh air and felt our lungs contract with the sudden blast of cold air. After so many emergencies, the relief at drawing breath on Earth again was indescribable. We threw our arms around each other, slapping each other on the back as best we could in our bulky spacesuits. Now, they had sent out a rescue signal, but they didn't know if anybody had received it. And it turns out that the Kremlin didn't, too far away. But several other local pilots in airplanes and helicopters did receive it and were able to find them. In fact, Alexei talks about one helicopter coming over, and Alexei, realizing it's a civil aircraft and wasn't going to be able to help them, was at first excited and a little disheartened. But the helicopter had different ideas. They actually had a rope ladder, they threw it down, and were motioning for Alexei and Pavel to climb up. Alexei describes this ladder, and he says that he knew there was no way they were going to be able to climb up this ladder and safely get back into the helicopter. So they're in a pretty precarious situation here. They're in Siberia, the sun is setting, and it's starting to get cold. They realize they're not going to get rescued that night, that it's just not going to happen. Well, the hatch door's been blown open, and because the snow is so deep, he talks about it being neck deep. I don't know if that was an exaggeration or not, but the door had actually slid into the snow and couldn't be found. So they had the idea that they were going to actually see if they could pull the parachute out of the trees and use it to kind of cover the door, and then they would sleep in the capsule that night. I used to paraglide, and I can tell you that pulling those things out of trees is a lot of work. It's really hard, and it usually takes a saw and cutting a bunch of branches, and you have to climb up into the tree. Well, sure enough, Alexei explained that they weren't successful at that. So things are getting pretty serious for them. It's getting darker, it's getting colder, and they're still in these bulk, heavy, and more dangerously wet spacesuits. And they realize that they've got to get dry, they've got to get warm, or they're going to die of exposure. So let me read to you what they do next. We had to strip naked, take everything off, even our underwear, and wring the moisture out of it. We then had to pour out what liquid had accumulated in our spacesuits. We went on to separate the rigid part of the suit from its softer lining. 9 layers of aluminum foil and a synthetic material called Deuteron, and then put the softer part of the suits back on over our underwear and pull our boots and gloves back on. Now we could move more easily. They get back into the capsule. They do their best to stay warm. They spend the night and they wake up the next morning to the sound of voices. So Alexei, realizing that people are looking for him, has a flare gun, gets it out, shoots it. These people come over on skis and find him. These rescuers had the idea that they were going to chop down a bunch of trees so that helicopter could land, they could get in it, fly back to Perm, and then get back to the Kremlin and, everything would be okay. But they can't do this. They're not successful. They can't cut down enough trees. They can't get the helicopter onto the ground. So they realize they're going to have to spend another night there. Now, this one's not as crucial because he's got a bunch of other people there. They build a very makeshift cabin, but they have a huge fire. The rescuers brought some meal. He says it's one of the best meals he's ever had. It's just cheese, meat, and bread, a very common snack over in Russia. And he says it tasted great. I'm sure it did after everything he went through. So they spend the night there. The next morning, they wake up and they ski out towards a large natural opening. The helicopter lands, takes them back to Perm, and from Perm, they're able to get back to the Kremlin. The third obstacle is finally overcome. They're back at home, national heroes. But imagine all of that. You think that you're going up into space to do a spacewalk. Nobody else knows you're going up to do that. Once you get there, it's broadcast on national TV, and you're this national hero. And then realizing you can't get back in the capsule, the TV goes quiet, and you just run into obstacle after obstacle. You can't get back into the capsule. You solve for that. You have all these issues getting back to Earth. You finally get back to Earth, and you're in the middle of Siberia, and you can't even get home. There are so many interesting stories like this about Russian history. Not only like I would consider that current Russian history, but all the way back. It's so interesting. If you guys want to learn how to speak Russian, and if you're interested in these cultural stories, be sure and subscribe to the channel. On Mondays, I do vocabulary. On Wednesdays, I do grammar. And on Fridays, we do a little cultural tidbit like we did today. Ну хорошо, тогда это все. Спасибо и увидимся.